Hello, and welcome to another of the continuing adventures of Judd. I'm Judd.
We have JD Mendenhall, Park Services Specialist, here with us at Ellie Schiller Homosassa Springs Wildlife State Park. And we have Park Ranger Andrew Moody, who's come all the way from Fanning Springs. And they're going to be discussing the early days of the attraction in the late 60s when Ivan Tour's Animal Actors Troupe was wintered here at the park. And they had all kinds of interesting animals that were seen on TV and in the movies. They have some interesting stories to tell, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Welcome. I hope everyone is enjoying Heritage Day. Like Susan said, my name is JD Mendenhall. I am a Park Service Specialist working in the Wildlife Care Department here at Homosassa. When Susan asked me to do this, it was a little bit out of my field. I mean, generally I'm taking care of animals, but one of the things that I've been asked to do is to kind of go over our programs that we give here at the park and fact check those programs, make sure that the information we're giving out is true, make sure the information we're giving out is factual. That's relatively easy when it comes to deer or manatees or those type of animals, but then when you come around the corner and you come to Lou, an African hippopotamus, it becomes a little more difficult to try to explain why he's still here. And so I began doing a little bit of research into exactly how Lou managed to get here to the park. And it so happens that while I was thinking about that, I was going through my bookshelf at home, and I picked up this book called The Gentle Jungle, and decided, well, it sounds like a good read. I had read it once before many, many years ago. So I started reading it, and suddenly a name began to appear in this book that was very, very familiar, Ivan Tours. This is about another gentleman named Ralph Helfer. But Ivan Tours' name kept kind of appearing, so I thought, So I began to do a little bit of research and began to try to find the connections between Ralph Helfer, who was a very well-known animal trainer for the movies, and Ivan Tours, and things began to kind of come together. And it was on that note that I kind of, Susan asked me to put something together, and I just kind of came up with this. Now, first of all, most people would not recognize this gentleman on sight. This gentleman is Ivan Tours. But I guarantee the name kind of rings a bell, and I will also guarantee you that where this gentleman is concerned, that for those of us who are in the baby boomer generation, that this man probably had a tremendous influence on us as young people, and we may not have even known that. So kind of keep that man's picture in your mind as we're talking here. Everything I'm talking about is pretty much the research that I did just trying to find out about a hippopotamus. Ivan Tours was born in 1916 in Hungary. I guess it was called Austrian-Hungary at that point. He was born in Budapest, and he grew up there. And actually, after he got out of school and began to make his way in the world, did a little bit of playwriting. But then he decided, well, things are getting pretty difficult over here. And he managed to make it out of Budapest only about 3 months before the actual start of World War II. He came to the United States, and he actually came over here to increase his education. But he got sidetracked a little bit when he had done some playwriting, and he went to Los Angeles. And the studios began to hire him for some screenwriting. And he did that for a few years. He was 23 years old when he started. Then, in 1941, when the United States entered the war, he immediately joined the Air Corps, the Army Air Corps, and was there. But I guess mainly because of his Eastern European heritage, he very quickly ended up with another agency. He ended up with the Office of Strategic Studies, and that became the CIA. And so there is evidence, although this whole remains cloudy, even what I could find out from writings of his children, even that particular part of his life is kind of shrouded. He didn't talk about it, and nobody's quite sure what happened. So not only do you have a man here who may have been, who was a very creative man, who was a playwright, that type of thing, he may have actually been a spy at one point. We do not know. Very, very, very Renaissance man here who did a lot, and you'll find out more. After the war, he came back and got his job back with MGM Studios, and they very quickly began to put him on screenwriting duty, and I'm sure most of you will recognize a lot of those pictures. These are some of the actresses and actors that he actually did screenwriting for. You've got Katharine Hepburn, you've got Greer Garson, you've got Judy Garland and Errol Flynn. So very early on in the history of this gentleman, he was rubbing elbows with some very famous people in Hollywood. It didn't take long for him to want to become more than just a screenwriter. He wanted to produce. He wanted to direct and produce his own films. So he partnered up with an actor, screenwriter, and they formed a company called I-Man Films. And I-Man Films, in the early 1950s, began to produce such films as, and I don't know whether you'll remember these or not, because these obviously were in that whole sci-fi genre. You see, Ivan Tors wasn't just a screenwriter, he was also a sci-fi fan. And as being a sci-fi fan myself, I can appreciate that. I can remember going to the movies, to the Lyric Theater in Winchester, Indiana, Saturday afternoon for a quarter. And this is what you would go see. You know, Storm Over Tibet, The Magnetic Monster, Riders of the Stars, Gog, The Truth About Flying Saucers, a documentary. Okay, so we're beginning to see the imagination of this man. It was beginning to come out. But, you know, again, he was a man who really had a vision, and he had more in mind. So he was a visionary. And about this time, there was a new medium coming on, television. Now, a lot of people in Hollywood at the time were saying television is a flash in the pan. It's never catch on. It's just going to be a fad. He didn't believe that way. He thought television really had something to go. So he got into television productions at I-Man Films, and he produced one of the first television series called Science Fiction Theater. Okay, now, I remember that. I was a sci-fi fan. And this is actually considered the father of all the preceding science fiction series that were based upon different story each week. And that includes, that includes The Twilight Zone. That includes Outer Limits. That includes One Step Beyond. So here again, you have a man who is visionary enough to really lay the groundwork for a complete genre, which eventually ended up with Star Trek, and we all know where that went. We all know where Star Trek and those franchises went. So he was very, very intuitive. Now, he also had a fascination with the ocean and the sea. And that's when he developed his next television series, and this one we all remember. When I do the program with Lou, I always mention this, and most hands who are of that generation go up and remember Sea Hunt. Now, he also did something very unusual with Sea Hunt. He went around to all the major networks trying to sell them this idea. None of them would buy. The thinking was, well, most of your filming is underwater, there's no sound, so there'll be all this silent, which is this action. You may as well go back to silent movies. Well, he overcame that by narrating the underwater sequences, and then he did something really unusual. He syndicated it. And this is one of the first widely syndicated films. What that means is he went to the individual television stations and sold them the rights, rather than going through a major network. And this is one of the first major television series to ever be syndicated. So again, we're looking at a man here who was very, very unique. During the filming of Sea Hunt, they began to develop their underwater filming techniques, which eventually led to an Oscar to Ivan Tors Studios for the underwater sequences in the 1965 film Thunderball, which was a James Bond movie. So led him a long way. About this time, Ivan Tors was getting very concerned in the direction that Hollywood was going. He didn't like the violence. He didn't like the sex. And he was kind of like a Walt Disney in that sense. He wanted family-oriented films. He wanted the family to enjoy. So he came up with this idea, this is probably one of his better-known ideas, for Flipper, for an underwater lassie. And what they did was they actually produced two feature films first. They produced Flipper and then Flipper, The New Adventure, both of which did very, very well at the box office and really led to the constructions of Ivan Tors Studios in Miami, Florida. And it also led to one of his major television series. I cannot give a program about Lou and mention Ivan Tors and mention Flipper that everybody's hands, even the younger generations, go up because it was in syndication for so long. And this man can be credited with really making dolphins known to the U.S. public. Now he was doing very well at this time, and as this picture kind of shows, he had some pretty influential friends. I think we all recognize the man in the middle there. That's Mr. Walt Disney, whose entertainment empire now practically controls the planet. I mean, they own just about everything. But as he was beginning to produce more and more films and more films that contained animals, he was beginning to find out that he needed a lot of animal actors. Now, he had made an acquaintance very early on in his life, and that's the man that you see here. Name was Ralph Heffler, and Ralph Heffler had a very interesting history, and I'm going to kind of sidetrack off of Ivan Tors a minute because it all directly feeds back to us here. And that is, Ralph Heffler was a man who absolutely loved animals all his life. Now, what has amazed me about this whole journey in trying to find out about Ivan Tors is these very unusual connections. Now, Ralph Heffler grew up in Hollywood, and he lived in an apartment building with a young lady named Carol. And this young lady was his best friend growing up, and they used to go out and hunt snakes together and go out and catch frogs together. And that young lady, the very famous Carol, was actually Carol Burnett, was his best friend. So anyway, he had those connections in Hollywood, but he loved the animals, and so when he got out of school, there wasn't a lot of jobs open to that, so he partnered with his uncle, and they started a pet shop in Hollywood. Well, soon, movie studios began coming to him, do you have a tarantula? Do you have a snake? When they needed small animals, they would come to this pet shop and say, and he began to take them in and kind of wrangle them for the film industry. Well, he was obviously a very good-looking young man, very fit. He tended to fit that Hollywood look, and so they began to ask him, can you do a stunt double? Can you do this stunt? Can you do that stunt? And he was needed the money, obviously, and was very, very open to doing that. Well, one day, they asked him to do a stunt with a lion. Now, he had worked with animals, but he'd never worked with lions. And they said, it's a very simple stunt. All you have to do, and you make the lion jump up on the platform there, and then it'll jump down, and that's all you got to do. So he talked to the trainer. They wouldn't let the trainer do it because he wasn't photographic enough. And they said, okay. So he gets in there, and the lion gets up on the pedestal, and then sees a weakness. And the lion immediately attacks Ralph Heffler and gets him down, and actually he said he could look up through his wrist and see the hole where the lion's canines had gone through. And so they finally got the lion off of him, and he was in the hospital recuperating for several days. And it started him thinking. It started him thinking down, what happened? Why did that happen? And here is what he came up with. Before that time, the main type of training that was utilized with animals for films was really negative reinforcement. What you're doing is you're making that animal do something it doesn't want to do by giving it something to be afraid of. It is negatively reinforced. And, it learns to really hate the trainer because the experience with the trainer is always unpleasant. And, one thing we've learned about animals today, and I don't think they quite understood back then, is that animals are very patient. They're not on the same time scale that we are. And they will wait. And they will plan. And then when the time comes, they will get their retribution. And that's exactly what he figured happened to him. So he came up with another idea. He came up with what was called affection training. And this was based upon actually treating the animal with love, with patience, with understanding, and with respect. And he did that with animals, and suddenly, with lions and tigers and bears, as we'll see, it was working. Now, it took a long time for Hollywood to accept this. Hollywood had a real entrenched negative reinforcement establishment with training. And, the studios were saying, no, we can't risk it. Before that time, generally in film, animals and actors did not appear in the same frame. If they did, it was a fake animal. There was a barrier between. It was camera trickery. But his reputation began to spread, and it came to the point to where the actors and the animals were now interacting with his animals. And as you can see, this was his daughter. This was a lion called Zamba. And the amount of trust that he had in these animals was there. Now, we run into a problem today because you're always hearing about, just recently I read about a lion that killed a trainer that had been on Ellen. So it's not just the training factor. It's the animal themselves. These animals were very special. Ralph Heffler and Ivan Tors, well, I have to show you this one because this one just blows me away. The fact that bear would tolerate that. And believe me, I work with a couple of bears we have here every day. There is no way, okay, on either one of them. No way. So anyway, what happened was Ivan Tors needed animal actors. Ralph Heffler had a facility in California where he was beginning to train animals using his animal affection techniques. And so they partnered. They actually made a partnership. From that partnership came probably one of the two best-known series that Ivan Tors ever produced, and that is Doctari, which ran for about 6 years, and Cowboy in Africa. And this collaboration was so successful that they actually built the film sets for these particular television series on Ralph Helfer and now Ivan Tors' compound. It's called Africa USA. And so they were actually filming out there where they were on the compound with all of these different animals. And so during that particular time, of course, they were not just producing television series. The movie Rhino was being filmed. I think you'll see the Zebra in the Kitchen. Anybody remember that one? Okay, Clarence the Cross-Eyed Lion. Clarence the Cross-Eyed Lion has a very, very interesting history. Clarence was actually born on the Africa USA compound. And Ralph Helfer was talking to Ivan Tors and actually said, well, maybe we ought to get rid of this animal because he was born cross-eyed. And it actually did affect his ability to see. They even tried corrective lenses at one point. Didn't work. But Ivan Tors said no. He said, you give me that animal affection trained, then I'll give you a star. And that's exactly what he did with this and with Cowboy in Africa. So again, he was very, very intuitive. Now, this is another connection I find very interesting. Namu, the killer whale. Who would have thought Ivan Tors actually started? Namu's history is he was one of the first killer whales actually captured and brought into captivity. It was purchased by the Seattle Aquarium. And Ivan Tors read about that and goes, I think we can use that. So they sent the trainer, one of his trainers up there, who had trained Flipper. No one had ever been in the water with a killer whale before. And they sent the trainer up there, and the guy goes, but killer whales eat people. And Ivan said, no, you can do it, you can do it. And he did. And they did manage to train this killer whale to perform in the film. Now, the interesting connection here that you wouldn't think about, Namu, they felt was lonely. So the owner of the aquarium wanted to bring in a female. So they caught a female and brought her in, and they didn't understand the psychology behind killer whales like we do today, and they didn't get along. But anybody know what they named that female? Shamu. And Shamu ended up going to SeaWorld in San Diego, which started the whole SeaWorld complex. So again, you've got Ivan Tors being involved very much, the first man to put a killer whale on film, the first man to bring a killer whale into the public eye, and to help people understand just how amazing these particular animals are. So he had quite a ground. Of course, he was producing films like Africa USA or Africa, Texas style, which eventually became Cowboy in Africa on TV. Not to mention the famous, I'm sure I've heard about this one, Hello Down There. It actually starred Tony Randall, but if you look very closely up here, you'll see that there's a very, very young Richard Dreyfuss. And a lot of the stars that we have today, the actors that we have today, trace their first break back to Ivan Tors. Now, what does that have to do with Homosassa? It's very interesting about this, but what does that have to do with this part? Well, Ivan Tors, as you can see from everything that you've seen here, was very creative, an entertainment genius. He was a visionary, but you can't have everything. And one of the things he didn't seem to have was a very sharp control over the money. He didn't quite know how to budget it. And when he was producing all of these films, he was borrowing very heavily. And one of his financial backers was named Bruce Norris. Now, Bruce Norris was the owner of the Chicago Cattle Development Company, who ended up coming down here to Citrus County and evidently buying most of this part of the county at one point, because he was the one who developed Sugar Mill Woods, he developed River Haven, and he owned this particular attraction. Well, when Ivan Tors financially began to get into trouble, Bruce Norris went in and he actually took over controlling interest of the company. And that was in 1968 when he did that. Unfortunately, this is where the downfall started. At that particular time, the partnership with Ralph Helfer went on the rocks. Ivan Tors' wife died of a heart attack. In 1969, there was a series of storms that came off the Pacific into Soledad Canyon and literally flooded the compound. In fact, just totally destroyed the sound stages and everything. And of the 1,500 animals, luckily they only lost 20. But that was another kind of nail in the coffin of Ivan Tors. And so at that point, he began to spend a lot of time in Africa. He took his sons, he had 3 young sons. He spent a lot of time in Africa doing a lot of work over there. And Bruce Norris tended to take over, I think, the everyday runnings of the film studio. Now, he was not an entertainer by trade. Part of the settlement of the dissolution of the partnership between Ralph Helfer and Ivan Torres was Helfer got the compound, the land, most of the animals, but Torres got the stars. So Norris owned this attraction here. This was about the time that Disney was getting ready to open up Disney World. I think they were beginning to feel the pressure even then. So in 1969, the announcement in the Ocala paper said, Homosassa Springs to open Wildlife Training Center. And the idea was that they would be training animal actors here in Homosassa and allowing the public to see them when they were not working, and they would continue the training. It was announced in May, I think. In June or July, they actually opened up the training center. Now, unfortunately, one of the places that I read of the account was that the training center was actually more like a retirement home for these animals because they didn't do a whole lot of work after that. But I don't know. I mean, that's what I've read so far. But the point being that this attraction became the center for something that I think is very, very important, and that's affection training. Because the affection training of Ralph Helfer is what I think is developed today into what we call positive reinforcement. And that's the training that most places are utilizing now. Not the whip, not the chair, not the negative reinforcement, but the positive reinforcement. And Homosassa played a key role in that, in being the place where these animal stars were brought, and that type of training was continued here. So I think really it is a fascinating era to look at. And the one thing I'll say, and I'll end with this picture where you've got those boys around Gentle Ben. The one thing I'll say is that while Ivan Torres may not be recognizable, he may not have the clout that Disney has, I will guarantee you that for every one of us baby boomers, the effect that Ivan Torres has had on us in one way or another is just as profound as what Disney has done with Disney World.